A lovely introduction. Good morning. Thank you all for coming on a Saturday morning to the Brown Theater. We're just going to have a seat. I brought some lovely and smart people with me this morning to come talk about stories, and really the way that I met all of these lovely and smart people is through story in some way or another. I'm going to ask them all to introduce themselves briefly because they all do a bunch of different things, and I want them to say what they'd like you to know about them before we get started.
Hi, I'm Ashlee Thompson. By day, I'm the digital director at Louisville Public Media. I also host the Moth StorySLAMs every other month that Tara is the producer of. I fashion myself a creative nonfiction writer.
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, I'll own that, yes.
You got a degree
I
in
write
it.
creative nonfiction, and I'm also a 3-time Golden Girl trivia winner, so... Not to brag.
Beat that, fellas.
Hi, I'm Fred Johnson. I'm a retired Army officer, colonel, served about 29 years. Now I am a teacher, a middle school teacher at Thomas Jefferson Middle School here in Louisville. And thank you. Go Patriots! Go Patriots! And I'm also the co-founder of Shakespeare with Veterans, which is a program created where veterans can tell their story through William Shakespeare, in my opinion, the greatest storyteller in English language. So,
cool.
Yeah.
I'm Joe Phelps. I'm the 4th grade spelling bee champion at Stapleton Elementary, Joplin, Missouri. Thank you. I won on the word museum, by the way.
That's a tricky one.
I am the Justice Coordinator for the Earth and Spirit Center here in Louisville, Kentucky, and co-chair with Dr. Kevin Cosby of Empower West Louisville, which is a black and white clergy coalition that seeks to empower and bring equity to West Louisville. I was for 21 years the pastor of Highland Baptist Church, wonderful congregation at the corner of Grinstead and Cherokee Roads, and retired from there in January of 2018. So I spend my time trying not to be busy. People ask me, what do you do to stay busy? I do not want to be busy. I walk dogs twice a day, and I spend a lot of time reflecting on my story. So I'm glad to have this conversation.
Excellent, excellent. So I have a question for all of these participants that came from a book I've been reading recently, thanks to you, who introduced me to Richard Rohr.
Right.
I bet a lot of people in this audience know the work of Richard Rohr.
Yes.
He's kind of a patron saint of this festival in some ways. I had never read Richard Rohr, but when Joe Phelps tells you that somebody's worth looking into, you go check it out.
Thank you.
So I've been reading the book Falling Upward. I think the subtitle is A Spirituality for the Two Halves of Life.
Second half of life, yeah.
Something like that. Talking about, essentially it's talking about a midlife crisis. Don't ask me why, I need to read this now. And he talks a lot about the idea of the hero's journey. That story that we have seen so many times in so many of our works of art, the idea that there is someone, a hero or a heroine,
Yes.
who needs to leave their home in search of something. And they go off and they have adventures and they pass tests, and then they come home, and often the answer is, oh, it was within you all along, right? That you needed to leave, but you already had the answers before you left. And one of the points that Richard Rohr makes in this book is that the hero or heroine returning home brings something of value to the village, to the people that they left behind. A gift, some kind of knowledge. The idea that if you don't tell your story about what you've been through, it's almost like it didn't happen. Not that it didn't happen, but that telling your story is as valuable as doing the thing itself. So all three of these people have told stories in public, in writing, different ways of sharing their own personal stories. We don't have enough time to go into all of them. You need to go talk with all of these people afterwards because they're amazing. But I wanted to ask you all, how has telling your story helped you understand it better? And how has telling your story changed your life? Would you like to start, Ashlee?
Sure. Wow, that's a really profound and tough question. But I think for me, I was hesitant to tell my story for a long time because, and I think if there are any writers or storytellers in here, which I'm sure many of you are, there's a hesitancy of like, well, who cares about this story, right? And also, well, you know, how am I so different than anybody else? Somebody else could write this story. But as a writer, I've realized that I'm the only person who can tell my story from my perspective, right? And for me, I had to own that, and that was really hard to say, yes, my story is important, as is, you know, the story of the person sitting next to me and the person sitting next to me and so on and so forth. So for me, I had to own that I had a story worth telling, thanks to, you know, being in a writing program, a little sprinkle of therapy, you know, that my story was meaningful, and not being afraid to be the voice that was a little bit different. I started my career in journalism, and I was afraid of being the Black writer, right? I didn't want to be limited in what I could write about because I was Black, because I was a Black woman. But then I realized, well, if I don't write stories that matter to me talk with my hands, this is really hard. If I don't write stories that matter to me as a Black woman, then who will? And I can't necessarily depend on someone else to write that story. And one thing I've learned about myself in telling my stories through writing, through storytelling, is that yes, my story is very similar because all of our stories are similar. And I know it sounds very trite to say like, well, we're all humans, but the fact that we can love the same and fear the same, but having different experiences, there's something really divine in that, and I think it unites us. And so by telling your story, you can reach somebody that has been in love or has been afraid or anything like that. Yeah, I just had to own it.
Excellent.
I grew up in a bar, literally. My dad was a bartender, and in his business, telling stories and really listening to stories was very important. My dad, who just passed away about this time last year, used to say, it's not the amount of money that you have or the toys that you have in the end, it's the amount of the stories that you can tell. So I grew up that way and looking and trying to find my story. And then I joined the Army, and I was in the Army for nearly 3 decades. And, you know, you have war stories. So I found this place where I could tell stories, you know, and listen to stories of people that have shared experiences. And then I retired here in 2014, and I left the Army and I came to Louisville, and I lost my stories a little bit. You know, who do I tell these war stories to? How do I make that connection? And then I found the Moth, and I found Tara and Ashlee and Graham Shelby, and I found a platform for me to tell my story, and the wonderful storytelling community of Louisville, which I think is the greatest city in the world, has allowed me to tell my story again. And I did that, and then about the same time, I founded Shakespeare with Veterans, which I'd been working at the Fund for the Arts, and I was working with Kentucky Shakespeare and Shakespeare Behind Bars, the great work that Kentucky Shakespeare, Matt Wallace does there at Luther Luckett, where they bring in inmates and they put on plays and they heal through Shakespeare. And I asked Matt, I said, can we do something like this with veterans? And typical Matt, sure. And we started this program. We're going into our 5th season now, and with Henry V, which is the soldier story. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. And then I wrote a book, and so I just had this great storytelling opportunity here in Louisville. And then I took a job where I kind of lost my way in storytelling. And for about a year or so, I had a job that just wasn't getting it. And then I heard that there was a shortage of teachers in Louisville. And I did what every grown-up does, is I went on Facebook and I complained about it. And somebody came back and said, hey, if you're a veteran, you can get certified to teach in a day. I said, that's not possible. Well, it is possible. And about 5 days later, I walked into Thomas Jefferson Middle School auditorium to the sound of 1,000, pubescent kids yelling at each other. So And I found my story again, because if you know, my storytelling platform through the kids and through what the kids bring to me as a teacher, and it's beautiful and wonderful. And I have one of my students here, Xavier Bowden's right here today, so I don't know where you're at. I just want to embarrass you, Xavier. So that's where it is.
Oh, right here.
Do it. Thank you.
I spent 22 years telling stories at Highland Baptist Church. Being a minister, you tell lots of stories as a way to illuminate or try to bring, to incarnate some of the truths that you're trying to convey to people. And so I've spent a lot of my life telling stories, and I realized that stories are, when you tell a story, you're selecting facts and you're selecting an event out of all the events of your life. You're honing in on one and you're telling that story. And so I've been thinking lately about all the stories that I've told over the years, and both what I was trying to say, but also who I was speaking to. Who's my audience? Mm-hmm. A lot of times my audience was me. And you tell lots of things to explain yourself to yourself, or to justify yourself, or forgive yourself, or encourage yourself. But all of those stories, no matter whether I think their origins or motives are good or bad, each one of those stories is a strand, though, of the larger story that's my life. And so that's what I've found myself doing lately, is giving thanks for the opportunity to tell lots of stories and bring experiences into word. But now, how do they all weave together to help me see my life in a wiser and more whole way? Not just for my own edification, but so that my next story can include some of that wisdom that I've gained. So that's kind of a fun exercise that I realize that I'm doing, and I didn't realize I was doing until we started talking about this program.
Wow.
So grateful.
Yeah. So at the Moth, when we ask people to prepare a 5-minute true story based on the theme, we also talk about how we're looking for a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, although they don't have to be told in that order. And we're looking for something that is at stake, right? There needs to be stakes in a story. Right. If there are no stakes, it's just an anecdote, right? This crazy thing happened and nothing changed. Yeah. And those are fun. I keep doing that too. Yeah. Those are fun and those are fine, but they're not a story. So we look for something that changed from the beginning to the end, and where the stakes are. And I think thinking about when you're trying to prepare your own story in some form, either written or spoken, that's where you really think about what the stakes are, right? Fred, I remember the first time you came to the Moth and you started your story. Do you remember the sentence?
I actually don't.
We're all on the edge of our seats. I don't remember exactly your words, but it was something about the first time I kissed a man.
Yeah, Heratula. Yeah, the first time I kissed a man. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I told it to the students too. They loved it.
Yeah. And Fred was telling a story about, he was a security guard, I believe?
He was a guard in Afghanistan. Right. And first time I met him, he was very reticent to talk to us because it was actually Ramadan. The guy I was with had pulled out something to drink, which was strictly against Islam, and during Ramadan, and he didn't like us very much. So I had to build this relationship with Heratula over time.
Right. And traditionally in Afghanistan, men kiss each other on the cheek as a greeting, right?
Yes.
Which is not how most American men do things. As in friendship, for sure. And especially, Army guys, right? And I thought it was a great way to begin the story, get us intrigued. Like, who is this person? Do we know him? Yeah. And then you establish the stakes. You showed us very clearly this was about a relationship that you needed to develop with this person. So I just always remember that. You did a great job of setting up the stakes for us.
Yeah, thank you.
Ashlee, you have told a lot of stories at the Moth as the host.
And embarrassed myself quite a few times.
Yes. So often the host tells a kind of like a little starter story.
Yeah.
To begin the evening. And so you've had to come up with a lot of these as well. And every once in a while I'll get kind of like a panic text in the afternoon, like, Tara, I can't think of anything.
Yeah, and she's like, yes, you can. I'm like, no, I can't. Yes, you can. She's a great producer. She jazzes you up when you need it.
And you always do.
Yeah.
So what is one way that you figure out how to set up the stakes of a story?
I have to work backwards to establish what the stakes are. Like, I think of a story that, maybe I've told a lot, or, that kind of seems like it might be an anecdote, right? But then I go to the end and I was like, well, how am I different at this point now than I was when this started? Or how is my relationship different? One relationship that I mine a lot and that I've told stories about at the Moth is the relationship between me and my mother. And it's kind of a different relationship because she's my mother, but she's also my hairdresser. And it's real intimate, y'all. It's real, right? And so I told a story about how I went natural and going from chemically straightening my hair to not. And, the end result, I was just like, oh yeah, so I wear my hair, as it naturally grows, and I love it. But I had to think, but how did that change my relationship with my mother? And
who was the one who was doing that chemically relaxing?
Yes.
And who does that for a living?
Yeah.
So to go to your mom and be like, I'm not going to do this thing that you do.
Yeah. So I worked backwards, and in that, that was probably the first time I ever told that story out loud to people, other than friends, about how our relationship was strained because I was choosing not to change myself in a way that's how she made her money, And since then, I've realized that really, that relationship changed so much, and the stakes was our relationship, But we've come out on the other side a lot stronger, but I've also learned a lot more about myself, about mother-daughter relationships, and about the relationship that Black women have with our hair in American society that values a Eurocentric standard of beauty. So it started out as the small, what 5-minute story am I gonna tell at the Moth? But now it's the next project, that's the book that I'm working on, is just exploring that. Oh, thank you. TBD when it'll be out. Yeah, so it can start as something small, but I like to start at the end and think about how am I different?
Yeah. Joe, now that you are not at a pulpit every week like you were for so many years, how do you find storytelling as part of your life and the work that you do now?
That's a good question. It is, it's disorienting after 42 years of being a pastor, where you have a built-in time, an assigned time to speak, to all of a sudden be silenced and cut off from that usual rhythm. I'm finding now that I tell stories or reflect on stories more than tell stories. I'm trying to be more of a listener than as much as a storyteller, because it occurs to me that I've been talking my whole life, so it's time for me to. I'm a white guy. I'm a male. I'm a Baptist. I'm a minister. I mean, all of those things have just put me in a pulpit for 40 years. So it's time for me to stop just talking and listen to the other stories and find the intricacies and the connections. Stories to me are like the little hooks in Velcro that connect things and people to each other. And so I've been usually the hooker, and now I like being. That's right.
Quote of the day, y'all. We know.
True confession.
Yeah.
Now I like being the hooked. I've always enjoyed stories, but now that I'm not having to produce a story, there's liberation to listen to stories, and I love that.
So this is perfect. This will lead us into the next section of our program. We'll have some music from Danny Flanagan, and then we'll have Joe Manning and his folks from the Louisville Story Program, and we will practice deep listening together.
Cool. Yeah.
Talking about telling your story and then listening to your story. Thank you so much, Ashlee, Fred, and Joe, for being here with me. It's been